I'm Sonja Livingston, and I'd like to share a little bit about how my interest in an 800-year-old cookie recipe led me to discover an even truer source of joy. First of all, I should just say that this was no ordinary cookie recipe. It is said to come from the great saint and mystic from the 12th century, Hildegard of Bingen. And lots of people know about Saint Hildegard, but in case you don't, as I said, she lived in the 12th century. She was a composer, an abbess, a mystic, a healer. She was an all-around medieval rock star, and she especially paid attention to the natural world, to the elements, the plants and animals, and how those things could be used in food and in other ways to bring people closer to God, and at the same time to improve our health, which she saw as one and the same. So this recipe was for a very simple spiced cookie. And let me just say, any cookie recipe gets me interested. But this particular cookie is called Cookie of Joy. They're St. Hildegard's Cookies of Joy. You can do a search for them online. And I actually got a recipe from this book, which is St. Hildegard's Kitchen. But there are many books about St. Hildegard, and there are many versions of this very simple recipe. And here's a saint's card, prayer card for Saint Hildegard, and she recommended these cookies to strengthen the nerves, to improve one's general mood, and to bring joy to the heart. So I thought, the pandemic was raging, and we'd recently lost my father-in-law, along with the, sort of everyday challenges of life. I thought, cookies of joy, and with St. Hildegard's recommendation, why wouldn't I try this recipe? And so all of that led me to the recipe, to the cookies, but eventually to discover more about the saint herself. As I've said, the cookie recipe itself is very simple. Even though there are variations, it's hard to really get a lot of variety just because there are the basic ingredients of spelt flour. St. Hildegard recommended spelt flour left and right. So she was a fan of spelt flour. You can use whatever kind of flour you want. And then some kind of sugar, brown sugar would be great, and cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves. So those are the sort of 5 basic ingredients. There are more or less depending on what you do. And what I discovered after making and eating these cookies, which did bring me joy, by the way, even though it was a sort of joy that comes from cookies, the real recipe I discovered in studying a little bit more about Hildegard's own life. And I looked at her life and her lessons and her writings, her music, her musical compositions, her prayers, her letters to people of the time, including very prominent men of the time. And all of that gave me a sense of, I discovered an even deeper recipe for joy, let's say, through St. Hildegard's life. And I boiled that down to 5 ingredients as well. Let's see, I've written them down. The first is solitude. The second is faith. The third is greenness. The 4th is commitment. And the 5th ingredient is a measuring cup. And I'm going to talk very briefly about each one of those ingredients. Born in 1098 to a well-to-do family, it seems, Hildegard was promised to the church at a very young age. She was the 10th child, and all evidence suggests that she was sent off to the monastery at age 8. So I think she's a really good example of looking at solitude, but also looking at the difference between isolation and solitude. And I imagine no matter how connected to God she was, even as a child, that would have been a great upheaval in her life to go from this large family to the isolation or quiet of the monastery and its particular rhythms. But it seems to have worked for her, no matter how much she may have struggled at first. We don't have a real sense of that, but even if we imagine that she did, she very quickly adapted, and she made what could have been isolation into a very fruitful and beautiful solitude. Now, certainly the rhythms of the monastery helped with this, but she immersed herself in nature. She prayed regularly. She was connected through art and music. And so just, again, that first ingredient of solitude is a basic one. I guess it's the equivalent of the spelt flour in the cookie recipe. You can't go anywhere without this sort of fruitful solitude, prayer, and connection to God. And St. Hildegard is a perfect example of that. So the second ingredient is faith, and certainly it's as important as solitude. And while Hildegard seems to have been, was special, she was clearly special as a very young woman, and probably as a child, she did not begin to write down, did not begin to record the many volumes for which she's now known until midlife. And these are her own words. She writes, "When I was 42 and 7 months old, the heavens were opened and a blinding light of exceptional brilliance flowed through my entire brain. I am the living light," a voice in the vision said. "Proclaim and write thus." So Hildegard explains that she didn't really want to follow that advice or nudge. It was a head filling with light, so more than a nudge. I think many of us can relate to this. We don't maybe get such a direct message, but we feel prompted or we feel called or, like I say, nudged. And often it's in a direction that we hadn't planned on. And to go forward even and especially when we do not feel necessarily comfortable, requires a great deal of faith. And Hildegard is an example of that faith. She's known for telling people to become a flowering orchard. And through her faith, she indeed became a flowering orchard. The third ingredient is greenness. And St. Hildegard was known or is known for this concept of viriditas, or greenness, which she saw as life-giving, found in nature, and inseparable from God. So she didn't just hang out outside studying rivers and plants and writing down cures for what ails us. She saw that connection, that being in nature, was a way of feeding her relationship with God. Here's a quote. She says, or writes, "All creation is a symphony of joy and jubilation. Every creature is a glittering, glistening mirror of divinity." And so this one, I think we know. I mean, a lot of us have the privilege of getting out in nature, but we often separate nature from our lives. We live our lives inside. I am inside my house right now, and I do tend to go out on my porch, and if I'm lucky, I'll get to do some gardening. But Hildegard reminds us that there really isn't a separation, even though we may impose it, and we do often impose it. And the more that we can get out in that greenness, that life-giving, glittering greenness, the more we are going to be connected to God. The fourth ingredient is commitment. And I found this maybe the most interesting because Hildegard, when she is known, is either seems to be for her music, or she'll often be claimed by, I don't know, there's a better word, but I'll just say hippie-ish people who are really into nature, and often people who maybe were raised Catholic but are on the outskirts of the church, or maybe have left the church. She, because of all of her work, speaks to actually lots of different people. But she was a wild card. She was a woman who not only wrote, or she seemed to have had a scribe, but whose thoughts were written down. She challenged, she made her unhappiness with the corruption in Rome known. She got into a skirmish over burying somebody on convent grounds who was not supposed to be buried there. So in many ways, she comes off as this very strong, rebellious woman, and she certainly was a strong woman. And yet she was committed to God. She was committed to her role at the convent. So I think she is an example of this paradox of being somebody who pushed the limits, who spoke, but always did that with God in mind. It wasn't about Hildegard, it seemed. And throughout her entire life, her long and fruitful life, she remained committed to the church. And the commitment's a tough one. I don't know, maybe it's not tough for you, but it seems for a lot of us. We like to, whether it's in personal relationships or our jobs or going to church and how we feel about religion, because everything isn't perfect, but how we deal with that imperfection is really important in terms of, I've learned in terms of my sense of not only connection to God, but my ability to be joyful or to sustain joy in my life. And so commitment is the fourth ingredient. The fifth and final ingredient is a measuring cup, which I use to indicate balance. I think it's hard to know what to make of Hildegard. In some ways, even though she was so prolific, she's not as well known, in part, I think, because people don't really know what to make of her. So different camps might claim her. Feminists will claim her, or ecologists will claim her, or musicians will claim her. But she didn't belong to just one camp. She was, because maybe so exceptional, she did it all. So she wasn't just a composer or a visionary or a folk healer or a poet or a doctor of church or a leader in her monastery. She was all of those things. And to try and see her through any, or sort of limit her or squeeze her into one box sort of misses the point of Hildegard's life and the example she offers us, which is one of dynamic and fruitful abundance rooted in faith and joy. Hildegard clearly loved this life, her life, the world around us, and she found evidence of the divine almost everywhere she looked. I almost get the image of somebody who just can't, there's not enough time to get it all in, and yet she did. She at least got a lot in, more than most people. And I think part of when you're following this recipe, one of the temptations might be to spend more time looking at faith or looking at commitment or maybe looking at solitude, when in fact it's the balance that allows it all to work. Everything that Hildegard did, working, eating, leading, praying, all of this was done as in balance. I have found in following her example that I too must balance out those ingredients. Even though it was a medieval cookie recipe that led me to her, ultimately I found the recipe for joy, the truer, deeper recipe for joy, in looking at the patterns and movements of Hildegard's own life, the way that everything was welcomed, everything was a part of the plan, all could be knitted together dynamically in the service of God. I hope that you will do two things. One, look up the recipe for Cookies for Joy and make some, because they're very simple and tasty. And two, that you'll learn more about Hildegard and see her, perhaps as I have learned to see her, as an example for joy and abundance in my own life.